Hey, it's Dr. Nina, and welcome to You, Your Body, and Your Health. Well, we are on our second episode. If you didn't get a chance to see the first episode last week, I definitely recommend you going on blackdoctor.org and checking that out. I pretty much talked about my is going to run just so you get a good idea of what you're in for on these Fridays at 12 p.m. noon Eastern Standard Time. Before I get to starting this conversation, it's much needed conversation. Why don't you hit the comments box and let me know where you're tuning in from? I would love to know that. And I only got 30 minutes here, so we are going to dive right in. So we are entering the phase where you're going to school. In case you didn't already know, Self-Care Awareness Month is September. And so we generally think about self-care as being something related to managing stress, right? So we manage our stress by taking care of ourselves. But a lot of people don't know that stress actually has a very strong link to the development of belly fat. Yes, the development of belly fat and other physical symptoms and weight gain in general. So, not just belly fat. And some of the reasons behind this relationship, you might actually surprise you. So, definitely tune in for this whole episode. And you definitely don't want to miss the successful aging segment, which every episode will have the last 5 minutes of the show. I'll give you a little kind of snippet of some things to take home, some key takeaways, so that you can age successfully. Okay, without no further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into the topic. Belly fat. So when I say belly fat in general, what am I talking about? Am I just talking about a little gut, a little beer belly? Well, I have a figure to throw up, and we are going to go into a little abdominal anatomy to give you a real idea of what belly fat is. Now, we're talking about a stress belly here because what we're really focusing on in this episode is how stress affects your body physically, but more specifically, your belly, hence the term stress belly. So, stress belly is what this show is all about. So, what does the stress belly look like? I can throw that picture up. All right. So if you take a look at the image, you'll see a belly that, some of you may have, no judgment. You may know someone who has a belly that looks this way. You may not have a belly that looks this way, but I guarantee you, if you're stressed out and you're aging, that was a little hint into what we're doing and what we're going to talk about in the last segment. That belly, the approach of that belly or the appearance of that belly may be a little closer than you think. So let's talk about it. We have three layers when it comes to belly fat. There's a first layer, which is called the subcutaneous layer. So that's subcutaneous fat located just underneath the skin. And it's the fat that's kind of jiggles and wiggles. And it's not just localized to the belly. So let me emphasize that belly fat can show up, or excuse me, so subcutaneous fat can show up in any part of the body. So usually that's the fat that we're trying to lose when we're trying to lose weight. So that's the subcutaneous fat. And again, it's that superficial layer. Just underneath that is that we have our abdominal muscles. Now, you may have heard of these as the six pack. This is what we're targeting specifically when we're in crunch boot camp, during the sit-ups and during all the crunches and all of these belly rockers and ab doers and everything we do, trying to really hone in on that. What we think is belly fat, we're actually working that little thin sheet of abdominal muscle. And so I want you to think about that as we progress through the show. That muscle is totally different than that subcutaneous fat. And it's also different from the visceral fat, which is the third layer. And now that's a deeper layer, very deep layer of fat that's located just behind the abdominal muscles. Now, this visceral fat surrounds all the internal organs. And I want to emphasize that it's not necessarily a bad thing. It gives cushion to those internal organs to keep them protected. It's an excess of the visceral fat that becomes a problem. An excess of visceral fat is linked to that stress belly that we're talking about. That's the trigger for the stress belly. So from a practical standpoint, I want you to look at this picture and think about it. Because of the location of the visceral fat, which is behind that muscle, when you have excess visceral fat, it's going to push that muscle out. So what happens if you push that muscle out? You're probably going to get a firm belly because there's a sheet of muscle laying on top of it. So usually, I know it sounds kind of crazy, but I can actually, I'm not going to say, well, diagnose for lack of a better word. I'm not a physician, but I can actually spot a stress belly by just seeing how it responds. A belly that jiggles a little bit, I can usually tell that's subcutaneous fat. I just usually tell people they need to do a little cardio to work on that. But a stress belly is usually very firm because it's behind that visceral fat growing behind that muscle. So that's the main distinction there. I also want to emphasize that between the fat and the muscle, they're both they weigh the same. You'll often hear people say, muscle weighs more than fat. That's not true. Muscle and fat weigh the same, but as you can see on the right side of the figure, muscle is a whole lot denser than fat. And I say that because when you have more belly fat, it's going to be more like volume because it's bigger than muscle, not denser, just takes up more space. So you're generally going to see more of a belly when it's a stress belly versus when you have someone that's more muscular inside there. So I really want to point that out. Now, in terms of the visceral fat, as it relates to stress belly, why? We're going to get into the why that visceral fat is so important and the linkages to stress. We're going to revisit that. But I want you to know first, there are 3 key points I really want you to take away. The first one is that, again, this visceral fat is a problem. It's linked to something called inflammation, which you've probably heard of before. There's a lot of talk about inflammation these days. And inflammation is linked to just about every health problem you can imagine. Heart disease, high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes. There's even a linkage of inflammation to COVID. So I want you to understand that inflammatory process is something that's triggered by visceral fat. And that is one of the issues with the linkages to stress. Inflammation alone can increase stress. That's in the absence of everything else. That's even in the absence of being mentally stressed out. Visceral fat is linked, that inflammation associated with visceral fat is linked to stress, specifically the stress hormones. It's known to increase the presence of stress hormones. But again, we're going to revisit this. From a practical standpoint, you should know that if most of your fat is around the belly like that, so basically at your waist rather than at your hips, that's something you've probably heard of as an apple shape versus a pear shape, you're at a higher risk of those related problems. And that's mainly because of the shape. Unfortunately, we cannot control our genetics, but there are some things you can do about it. And I'm going to talk about a lot of those things at the end. Let me clarify because I'm getting a lot of questions in here too. I will be back to answer a lot of these questions. Even if I don't get to your questions during the show, I will be back. But I do want to get into these key points because you're asking some great questions here, and I'm definitely going to get to those. Now, back to the whole apple shape versus pear shape thing. The key takeaway with this one is you can watch it, you can manage it. Your waist circumference is a very good indicator of your risk of stress-related health problems or belly fat-related stress. And stress-related belly fat, because it's kind of a relationship that's like a cycle. And I'll get into that in a second too. I jumped ahead. If you're a woman, your waist circumference should ideally be under 35 inches. If you're a man, it should be under 40 inches. So anything greater than that is going to put you at risk of these problems that I'm talking about. So good morning, everybody. Or it's afternoon for me. Good morning for people who are on the different coast. I'm in the East Coast, but good morning to you all who have a morning, and good afternoon to those of you who have an afternoon. And again, we are talking about stress belly today, and I'm going into the stress mechanism in general. So again, I want you to take that belly fat image, keep it in your head as we continue the conversation. Now, stress. What is it? What is stress in the first place? I talked about it a little bit in the first episode, but we're going to really hone in on the topic in this episode. Stress is essentially how the body and the brain, how the brain and the body, and because it's in that order, respond to any demand. Brain, then bodily response to any demand. Any demand. So basically, any type of challenge in your life can be stressful. This can be performance at work or school. This can be a significant life change. It could be a traumatic event. It can even be intense exercise for some people. That can actually be something that stresses you out. Now, here's the deal. We're getting into that cycle now. It also triggers inflammation in the body. So stress also influences inflammation in the absence of belly fat. So you got this stress induced inflammation and you got belly fat induced inflammation. Two totally different things, but they can be a cycle. It's kind of like a conundrum. And here's the deal. Stress is highly subjective. It affects all of us in different ways. So it's really hard to pinpoint your stress from my stress. Everyone is different. And here's another thing. How you perceive stress can influence how you respond to it and how your body responds to it. And we're going to talk about different ways to, channel your stress and control your stress as we move on in a later segment of the show. But I want you to think about that. How you think about stress, what you call a stressor, is really under your control to a certain extent. And it will influence how your body responds to it. So I have a couple of questions still coming in here. I will get to your question soon. Gonna move on because I'm also looking at my time. These are some great questions too coming in, by the way. I'm very excited to answer these. All right, so we're talking about stress perception. Some of us have better mechanism of coping. This is just a pure fact. Some of us just cope with stress better and we recover more quickly from it. So if you're sitting in traffic, if you're sitting in bumper to bumper traffic, for many people, this could be stressful. I mean, I tell you, to this day, personally, I don't like driving. I'm from Chicago. I live in the Atlanta area now. And to be honest with you, between the two places, road rage is not it's just not my strong point. And it really does stress me out, the process of driving in both places, in any place I go. For some people, it's just like that. It could be a flight delay, or it could be a simple argument with a family member or a friend that stresses you out. We're going to talk about solutions to that in the end too. But you got the other class of people. You may be one of these people, honestly. You may only respond to stress when something that really big happens, like a death in the family or a divorce or a personal injury or illness. Now, for someone who's deconditioned, or if you just plain old hate exercise, like I said before, the notion of starting to exercise can be a stressful event. So here's the key takeaway from this. We're going to get stressed out. I mean, it's just nothing we can do to control the things that happen in our environments, things that are outside of our control. You're going to get in traffic. We're going to experience the deaths of friends and loved ones. It's just stuff, unfortunately, that's inevitable. But the key thing is, over time, prolonged and repeated exposures to certain types of stresses can be harmful to your health. There are certain things that are under our control. There are certain things that are not under our control. And really understanding how to process those different stressors and really change the way you perceive them is the key to controlling that stress. So now I want to move into the stress response itself, because I've talked about them separately. I've kind of talked about stress and I've talked about inflammation. I'm sorry, belly fat, and I've talked about inflammation. But I want to start bringing these all together. And in order to understand that, you got to get into the stress response. Now, here it is. Stress is caused by a stressor. It's not rocket science, right? Stress is caused by a stressor. So the stressor essentially elicits what's called a stress response. In a dangerous situation, a stressor will signal your body to prepare to face a threat or a perceived threat. So to face a threat or to flee from it, to flee to safety. This is referred to as a fight or flight response. And you've probably heard that before. This is a primal mechanism. The perfect example of a fight or flight response is when you're in an environment with a lot of people and someone starts running. What is the first thing you want to do? First thing you want to do, I answer the question easily in the comments box. It's run. Everyone starts running, and then you're like, oh shoot, and you run. That's a fight or flight response. And think about what happens to your body when that happens. Your heart rate generally increases. You might breathe really fast, so your breathing rate increases. You might feel that thumping pressure in your chest. And something that you may or may not perceive is a heightened sensitivity to sights and sounds, because what your body is doing is trying to prepare, your brain is trying to prepare your body for those reactions to that perceived threat, even if the perceived threat isn't real, even if someone is just running for no reason. The goal of the body in the fight or flight response is to fight or to run, and that's flight. Again, this is a primal mechanism. But here is the issue. That primal fight or flight mechanism should ideally be followed by something that's called a rest and digest response. Problems arise when the body is constantly in fight or flight. You're always fighting, and you can't calm down enough to rest and digest. So again, we need to be able to learn how to process the different types of stressors in order to recognize when our body should actually be in fight or flight. Like to let the body know, is it necessary for me to go through all this? Because there are effects, again, to that long-term stress or that chronic stress, as I put it. Chronic stress is a situation where your body is constantly in flight or flight. That's contrary to an acute stressful situation, which is something, again, that's that one event happening. It's that repeated exposure, that chronic stress that puts the body in that constant fight or flight mode. And that sets off a cascade of events that start in your brain and lead to a very well orchestrated release of different stress hormones. And they affect every single body in the system. So over time, that continued strain, it contributes to those health problems that we associate with stress: heart disease, high blood pressure, diabetes, sleep disturbances, mental health issues, depression, anxiety, you name it. Stress is linked to everything. So here's the key takeaway from that stress response. Please listen to me, folks. You can have the healthiest diet and even the most perfect workout routine, but if you're constantly under stress and you're doing very little to manage it, you are still at risk. So then we get to that stress belly. Now, that stress belly is both a risk factor and a consequence of the chronic stress. I have a little slide to show you that. I want to sum it up really quick so I can move on to these solutions. So you have that belly fat picture I showed you before. Now you got that excess visceral fat that I talked about before that increases inflammation. This raises hormone levels. And then you got that chronic stress that increases visceral fat storage, and that increases belly fat overall. Now we're going to get into the mechanism of why, but to sum it up here, chronic stress is going to increase insulin resistance, which you've probably heard of before. Insulin resistance leads to visceral fat storage. Then you have excess visceral fat that triggers inflammation, and then inflammation that raises stress hormone levels, specifically cortisol, which we'll get into. And it just keeps going. It just keeps going. It's a cycle. So to understand why, you have to understand how the hormones work. So we have cortisol, which is generally referred to as the stress hormone. We're going to talk about this one. It prepares the body for fight or flight in every situation that's perceived as bad. This means that it can become elevated from a simple argument with your friends or family member to something life-changing. Now, here are the effects. Well, cortisol has many effects on all the systems, as I told you, but specifically related to belly fat is the sugar. It increases the amount of sugar in your bloodstream. And then if you continue to be stressed out, if it keeps going and keeps going, these prolonged elevations can eventually trigger insulin resistance. And that's a condition when the body can no longer process or respond to the effects of insulin. You basically overloaded your body with sugar so much that it can't respond. This is a whole nother conversation that we're going to have in another show. Now, hyperglycemia, that is that increased glucose and insulin resistance, are classic risk factors in type 2 diabetes. So this cortisol-induced insulin resistance leads to fat storage in the visceral area, hence the term stress belly. And again, it's a vicious cycle. Again, I told you about that cycle. Chronic stress leads to insulin resistance. Insulin resistance leads to visceral fat storage. Visceral fat triggers inflammation. Inflammation raises your cortisol levels, and it just keeps going and it keeps going and it keeps going. So what can we do about it? Well, the first one, I'll give you some general recommendations, and then we're going to get more specific. So take notes here, because this can be fixed. Eat well-balanced meals. I'm going to talk about each of these a little bit more. So that's the first one. Eat well-balanced meals. Regularly engage in exercise. Exercise is critical. Exercise actually has insulin-like effects that help reduce blood sugar levels in general, and it increases endorphins. So those feel-good hormones that just make you feel better. Get adequate sleep. I cannot emphasize this one enough. Getting sleep is so critical for stress because lack of sleep actually increases cortisol levels. We're going to do a whole separate show on sleep, because lack of sleep is one of the primary reasons that cortisol levels increase. As a matter of fact, most of the research shows that if you have that atypical work schedule, more of the twilight shifts, your cortisol levels are raised, and you may find yourself with more belly fat just for working that shift. So we have to get in at least 6 hours of sleep. And even if you're one of those people that think you can function on 4 or 5, you may be able to function, but your body doesn't like it. It does not like when you're not sleeping. So you may think you're all good, but your body doesn't. Taking the short and long-term breaks is another big one. And I say that because sometimes you just need a rest, even from social media. We need a rest from social media because all that stimulation can raise cortisol levels. So when we're talking about stress belly, I want you to just think cortisol, cortisol, cortisol. Anything that has that cortisol amped up, that's going to increase that risk of that insulin resistance, that excess sugar. So please take that into consideration when you're amping yourself up at work and you're putting all your energy and efforts into it so much that you're not sleeping, you're not eating well, and you're not exercising. It's you, it's your body and your health, not that job, not those kids' problems, not those parents' problems, not those friends' problems. So you have to take it easy. And I can't emphasize that enough. And another one here, this is a critical one. Talk to people for support. I look, I grew up in a Pentecostal church. I'm not talking about really going to God all the time. God listens if you're a believer, right? But there comes a time when you have to talk to a professional for support. And don't be afraid to do that. Talk to others. And I don't just mean putting all your stress on your friends and loved ones either. Sometimes when that stress is amping up, you have to talk to people about it. Now, that may make some people upset that I said that, but it's something that you really need to think about, especially in our circumstances as a people. We tend to look at getting professional help as sometimes it could be a stigma, and you would not believe, I've had therapy, how much a simple conversation can help. Now, this is a very important one. Avoid drugs abuse and alcohol abuse. This is a big one because the simple act of getting on those and trying to get off can be a stressor, aside from the fact that many illegal drugs increase cortisol levels in and of themselves. So now that I've talked about the general solutions, let me get a little bit more practical for the time that I have. And we're going to actually take this and move some of it into the successful aging segment as well. When you're eating, focused on fat and focused on protein, because your protein and fat intake helps you better moderate the way your blood sugar responds. Haphazardly consuming carbs does what? Trigger elevations in cortisol. We don't want that. So put a little fat and a little protein in every single meal that you have. A lot of these we're going to get to in later shows. Lift weights. This is something that we're going to talk about more in the successful aging segment. Up your cardio intensity. Again, this one is definitely one that I emphasize because those endorphins, when you exercise more intensely, even for shorter periods of time, that endorphin releases increased a whole lot. And I know I've left this one out, but most important is those meditation and relaxation techniques. You got to get those in. The goal here is to induce that rest and relaxation response, that rest and digest response. And the best way to get that in is with meditation and relaxation techniques, even things like yoga or just breathing, deep breathing. We're going to do a whole episode on that in general, but I want you to know. And most important, be spontaneously physically active to really keep your body moving because that spontaneous physical activity is like that insulin-like effect of exercise. So when you're always moving, you're controlling that insulin and therefore that cortisol. So we're going to revisit these as we move into the Aging Successfully segment, because the truth is we're all aging. We're aging, as I said in the last show, from the time we're born. So I want to talk about some things that will help, because aging, ding, 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 also increases inflammation. It's crazy. It just keeps coming back. As we age, our bodies tend to become more inflamed. This increases stress hormones, and it can ultimately increase that risk of stress belly. Age-associated inflammation is a natural phenomenon. We don't know why it happens, but it happens. And so this is something that is going to represent another barrier to your stress belly. Declining metabolism adds to the stress belly dilemma. From the time we're about 30, metabolism naturally starts to decline. So the best way to control that stress belly as we age is to keep that metabolism at a healthy level while also supporting stress reduction. So here are 3 ways to do that. And this is your Aging Successfully tip that also ties into the other solutions. Exercise and eat well for better health and better sleep. I'm bringing that sleep back. Protein and fat consumption is key. You're probably listening to me say that fat and saying, why is she saying eat fat when I'm trying to reduce belly fat? Because for a long time, society has wanted us to believe that fat was a bad thing when it's actually a good thing. Eating fat actually helps the body better absorb the nutrients in the foods that we perceive as healthy, like vegetables and fruits. Those vegetables and fruits house specific antioxidants and anti-inflammatory like nutrients that are better absorbed when we eat fat with them. So lose the fat-free dressing and put fat on your vegetables. Eat more fat. Add a little avocado to your diet. Eat more fat. You can eat fat in your yogurt. It's not a bad thing. These are conversations that we will have in the future. And add that protein to your diet, because protein helps keep your metabolism intact. As we age, you're going to love protein. And that brings me into number 2, which is weightlifting a priority, folks. I cannot emphasize this one enough. This is the one thing that we stop doing when we get older, especially women: weightlifting. Weightlifting is going to help us preserve muscle. And yeah, it's going to work that little skinny part of the belly, that little thin part of the belly as well. So as you lose that belly fat, you're going to be building up that muscle so that when that belly fat is gone, that muscle can show and shine. So yes, make weightlifting a priority and eat your protein and fat to make it better. And finally, get in 20 to 30 minutes of daily outdoor activity. That's your spontaneous stuff. Not only does it increase your endorphins and therefore lower cortisol levels, but it also gets you that vitamin D that you need as you age. Helps your body better absorb calcium when you have that vitamin D. So that was a lot. I know I gave you a lot of information in a little amount of time, but thank you for tuning in. And know that when you continue to tune in to you, your body, and your health, you'll get more expansion on these topics. It's only so much I can cover in such a little amount of time. So keep tuning in, because every single topic that I've highlighted here is one that we'll be addressing separately. So I want you to do this for me as well. Make sure you tell a friend about the show if you're liking what you're hearing, because this is something that's about you, your body, and your health. But you should also want to give a little shout out to me to help your friends, their bodies, and their health. So please do share the show with your friends, seriously. And if you ever want to get in contact with me, I am very active on social media. Thatsaladlady.com is pretty much at every single Instagram channel, or excuse me, social media channel that I have. I was thinking ahead. That Salad Lady on Instagram is that.salad.lady. But everywhere else is That Salad Lady. And be sure to also check out thatsaladlady.com to get you plenty of fat, rich, high protein recipes to help that belly, to put the belly fat at bay, that stress belly at bay. Thank you so much for tuning in. I will be answering all of your questions out offline. I will get to them, trust me. And I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and see you next week. Take care.